Thank you for joining us online today. It's my great pleasure to welcoming you and you all on behalf of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, Nrgi, and ETH Zurich. My name is Fritz Brucker. I am the co-director of the ETH Center for Development and Cooperation NADEL. This webinar is also the closing event of our joint advanced course on natural resource governance and the energy transition. This advanced course has gathered more than 30 participants from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and we look very much forward to continue the engagement with all of you as alumni as you engage in the work in your countries. But also a very warm welcome to all others who joined us just for this webinar. The topic of this session is equitable energy transition in light of global crisis. The energy transition has become more pressing than ever. And while the first high-profile companies announced to pull out of carbon business, we ask, what does this mean for producer countries? How can producing countries manage the risks when companies run away? How to compensate revenue loss? But the energy transition also becomes more complicated in light of the current crisis and the war in the Ukraine. What does it mean that countries are all over the world struggling to get enough short-term supply of oil and gas? Does this delay the transition or even change the direction of the transition? My colleague Ana Carolina González Espinosa will discuss these questions with our distinguished panelists. Ana Carolina is a political scientist with a long-standing career in resource governance as a researcher, as a practitioner in Colombia, and as a member of the global board of EITI. Today, Ana Carolina is Senior Director for Growth Programs at Nrgi. And with that, Ana Carolina, over to you.
Thank you, Fritz, and thank you to all for being connected to this event. As you say, the discussion that we are having today is very important. In the last 2 years, resource-rich countries producing oil, gas, and minerals have had to face major disruptions in international markets that have importantly affected their development and the possibilities to mobilize resources from which many of them are heavily dependent. And commodities markets have always been volatile, so one could say that the uncertainty that these countries have encountered is not new. And as a matter of fact, an important part of the discussion about the governance of the extractive sector have been related to how to manage volatile revenues at the national and local level. However, one could claim that what has happened in the last years is significantly disruptive, and it goes beyond short-term changes in the markets, that it could have actually long-term implications for the development perspectives in resource-rich countries. First, COVID and the important barriers that you mentioned in the global supply chain, and the deep economic crisis that many developing countries are experiencing as a result. Then the war in Ukraine and its implication in the energy markets, the high prices of oil and gas, and the new geopolitical considerations in partnerships, more broadly, the imminence of the climate crisis and measures to accelerate the energy transition globally with what this could mean for fossil fuel producing countries, but also for countries producing critical minerals that are important for this energy transition. And at Nrgi, at ETH, we have been developing analysis about the implication of these countries, of this crisis in different countries in Africa, MENA, and Latin America, with a special attention to various of the memorandums of understanding signed by the European Union today to respond to that crisis. So we are very pleased to be able to listen to our great panelists of today about these topics. We have a very distinguished panel today, and I will propose for our panelists 3 rounds of questions. They will have around 5 minutes to respond to them, and in each round, and after that we will open for questions and answer. But let me first introduce the great panelists we have today. And as I am mentioning them, can you please open your videos? First, we have Linda Tamakloe, the Deputy Manager of the Institutional Reporting with the National Oil Company, Ghana National Petroleum Corporation, GNPC. Linda is a member of the Ghana EITI multi-stakeholder group, of the EITI International Commodity Trading and SOE Working Group, and also the OECD Development Center on SOE Working Group for the selection of buyers of publicly owned commodities as part of the thematic dialogue on commodity trading transparency. And she has been a strong proponent of transparency and accountability in the management of oil and gas revenues flows and the role of strong institutions in ensuring sustainable growth in the sector. We have also welcomed Linda. We have also Ana Sofia Tamborrel, Senior Ed, the Climate Justice Coordinator within the Climate Policy Team in ICM in Mexico, where she works on climate transparency and just climate transition. Ana Sofia has master's degree in development practice from the University of California at Berkeley, and a bachelor in international relations from the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. And she has an important experience on advancing the country's and the region's climate action. She has been a researcher with the University of California and a consultant for several institutions. Welcome, Ana, and thank you for being here. And finally, we have Professor Paul Stevens, educated as an economist and a specialist on the Middle East at Cambridge and the School of Oriental and African Studies. Professor Stevens have been a lecturer and teacher at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon, at the University of Surrey, at the University of Dundee, where he is now Professor Emeritus, and has been visiting professor and consultant for many other universities like Stanford, like UCL in Australia. And since 2008, Paul Stevens have been working part-time with the Chatham House, where he's a distinguished fellow, also distinguished fellow at the Institute of Energy Economics in Japan, in Tokyo. And Professor Stevens have published extensively on energy economics, the international petroleum industry, economic development issues, and the political economy of the Gulf. So welcome, Professor Stevens. We are glad to have you here. And with that, let me then start with the first round of questions for our panel, which is about the global crisis. Fritz and myself, we just mentioned that developing countries and producing countries are facing various crises. So what are we talking about? What is this global crisis about? And maybe let me start with Paul, asking you, how would you describe this global crisis in relation to energy markets after COVID and the war in Ukraine? What are the main trends that you are observing?
Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, good day, good evening, wherever you are, to all the audience. Let me start with a couple of general points. I'm going to focus largely on oil. And the reason for this is because I can make generalizations about global oil, but the problem with gas is its regional markets, and I don't have time to go into the necessary details. Secondly, these are very complex issues. If something is simple and wrong, it's simplistic, but it's simple and right, it's elegant. I'm seeking elegance, but I doubt I'm getting anywhere near that. So do forgive heroic generalizations. Let me start with the impact of COVID. It led to a major recession globally, which in turn led to a dramatic fall in oil demand, which then led to a dramatic fall in oil price. Indeed, in April 2020, the price of WTI went negative. In other words, you had to pay somebody to get rid of the stuff. Now, one of the consequences of the fall in price was a dramatic fall in investment in new oil producing capacity, but more importantly, in terms of maintenance. Now, as the pandemic recedes, and it's not over yet by any stretch of the imagination, you've begun to see an economic recovery. And this in turn has led to an increase in oil demand, which started to come up against capacity constraints, in part because of the lack of investment that I already mentioned. And this then led to increasing prices, a process that was aggravated by OPEC Plus manipulating the market deliberately in order to increase prices. Into this mix, we then put the war in Ukraine. One of the immediate consequences of this was that Russian oil was sanctioned. Now, we can have a long debate about the effectiveness of such sanctions, but the result of that was it reinforced the increase in price. So prices, which had been around the $80 mark, moved to over $100. So in effect, the crisis that we're talking about, the energy crisis, is in fact a macroeconomic crisis as a result of price spikes. Now, those prices are likely to stay high for as long as the war in Ukraine continues. How long will that be? I have no idea, but I suspect it's going to go on a lot longer than many people think, which means that effectively we have moved into the realms of price spikes, higher prices, and we're going to stay there for some time. And this is going to have serious macroeconomic consequences. I'll say more about this in relation to the next question, but at that point I'll stop and pass back to the chair.
Thanks a lot, Paul. And maybe let's move now to country level with Linda. How do you think this crisis Paul is mentioning is materializing in Ghana? What are the trends, the main challenges that you are observing at the country level?
Thank you, Anna. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be part of the discussion today. As Paul stated, and I will take on from there, you know, a war, and for that matter, any crisis is by its nature, there are so many unknowns and uncertainties. And the effects of this will be felt for years to come. What we can be certain of is that the results will result in changes in behavior. The crisis will offer opportunities and risks. How we are positioned as countries for these opportunities and risks is what will determine how the story will be told in future. How we change our behaviors as economies will also shape what is to come. Having said that, Ghana, as like any other country, has had adverse effects from the crisis, well, since 2020 anyway. We're in the process of recovering quite slowly from the downturn of COVID. Land borders were still closed as at the first quarter of 2020, and this had huge implications on our trade with our neighbors, especially as it meant that traders looked for illegal routes to continue trading, and this also has serious security implications for the region. Generally, there have been loss of jobs, price hikes, food price hikes, which is as a result of the fuel price hikes and production. Energy security is threatened, food security is threatened, energy poverty is heightened as lots of people are already do not have access to some sources of energy, but those who even have access to electricity, access to clean cooking fuels, will be priced out of the market because of the increase in utility tariffs and fuel prices. Inflation is going up, increased cost of living. There's agitation by organized labor for wage increases. Some of the challenges, I think, all this micro and macro economic dynamics bring to the fore will be that even though Ghana is an exporter, exports crude, the benefits of high prices may not necessarily have a strong impact on our fortunes because we have such huge import bills for crude. the sources of revenue in the economy are not expanding either. The tax net has not expanded. New sources of tax revenue that were identified have not quite materialized. I'm sure you've heard of something called the e-levy, which technically is a variable tax and was supposed to yield enough to bridge some of the gaps that we have. Borrowing has increased, and currently we are in discussions with the IMF. So it begs the question, how sound was the economy even before 2020? I'll leave it at that.
Thanks a lot, Linda. And it's very interesting how you mentioned discussion about energy security that might be very pressing and important for Europe and the global north in general, is very present also at the country level in developing countries, but with an additional configuration that is the discussion about energy poverty, right? We are not just discussing about sourcing energy, but it's about how to provide access to energy to many vulnerable communities in our countries. And also very interesting what you mentioned and challenging, of course, this idea of a new resource boom coming on, that countries cannot actually benefit that much because of this boom happening in the middle of a very strong recession at the country and at the global level, of course. So Anna, how is this crisis materializing in Mexico, but how is also the general debate about energy transition and climate change going on in the country? What are the challenges that you are observing?
Hi, Ana Carolina, and hi, everyone. Thank you again for inviting me. So in Mexico, the energy sector is a very controversial sector since a few years back. We've had governments that have leaned towards increasing private investment, and now governments that are leaning more towards protecting national companies. So within that range, the energy transition has also been shifting in terms of how governments have approached it. A few years back, the government was very much for the transition with technical and financial considerations, but without any social considerations. And this posed a huge problem, especially for local communities where renewable energy projects wanted to be built. Now, this administration that took power in 2018 has shifted away from renewable energies and more towards strengthening the state-owned energy companies. And we have a very big electricity company, and we have a very big oil company. And this has meant that the oil sector in Mexico has been attempted to be strengthened. We are actually a country that is building a new refinery in an age that we should be moving away from more investments in oil and in gas. Mexico has been moving towards that since this administration. And actually, and I know we're going to be talking more about that in the next set of questions, but what is now happening in Europe has provided as some sort of like a narrative legitimacy to going back into strengthening oil and gas in Mexico. So this is very controversial, and this is very worrisome for a country that has been making strong efforts to move away from fossil fuels and develop a renewable energy industry with social inclusion. So the debate has sort of gone back a few steps when we were talking about how we can include the social component and how we can include justice for the energy transition. We are now having to move back into arguing why we do want renewable energies and why do we want to move away from fossil fuels. So we've kind of stepped back in a context of high inflation, in a context of labor, also a labor crisis, and slowing down the growth rates. Also, particularly in Mexico, we have a highly subsidized energy and electricity sector. So it's it's also different in terms of how the consumer is feeling this crisis, because a lot is being I forgot the word. A lot is being sort of like is smoothed down by the subsidies, but it's being expensive for the government, who actually saved a lot of money when the prices of oil went down, but now is having to sort of like balance it out. And even with those subsidies, the consumers are starting to feel it, and we have inflation rates super high in a country that is already highly unequal. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you, Ana Carolina.
Thank you, Ana. And you are bringing the arguments and the ideas for our next round of questions. With what you are mentioning, it's happening in Mexico. It's impressive how we are going back to discussing why do we need an energy transition and not how to promote this energy transition. So let me go back to Paul and discuss, ask you, Paul, to discuss a little bit about what are the main impacts this crisis is having in relation to energy transition globally? What are the trends that you are observing in terms of this policy change, these changes in narrative, as Ana mentioned them, geopolitics, and the type of agreements that countries in Europe, the US, and other countries are making with new producing countries or producing countries in general? What are you seeing out there?
I think the whole situation has had a major impact on energy policy generally throughout the world. And the main impact it's had is to move energy security of supply right back up the policy agenda. We're in effect going back to the early 1970s here, where many countries, and this is true whether you're talking about the industrialized countries or developing countries, are now very concerned about their energy security of supply. And the consequence of this, I think, is going to be an increasing emphasis on renewables. And the reason to that is because renewables are decentralized, but domestic. And so what you're going to see is a dramatic increase in the use of renewables, and that will speed up the transition, a factor that's also being reinforced as we're seeing serious signs of climate change. I mean, if you've been watching what's happening in Europe over the last 2 weeks, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about in terms of fires and all the rest of it. And this is all going to increase the speed of the transition. However, and it's an important however, I think there's going to be an interim period. And this is going to be when consumers, especially in Europe, which is highly dependent upon Russian gas and oil, try to seek alternative suppliers to Russia. And in those circumstances, the shift to renewables will go through a little bit of a blip, a little bit of a slowdown. You're already seeing this in terms of talk about returning to coal in Western Europe, emphasis on things like renewables, etc. Now, what's the significance of this for the producers of the South? Well, the faster the transition is, the producers of oil and gas will face increasing competition for a declining market share. More producers will be seeking to get more market share in a market that's declining as renewables begin to take over. Now, the losers in this situation are going to be the higher cost producers. Now, this applies to a lot of new producers and also those producers that are operating deep offshore. The ones that will be left standing will be the low-cost producers. And to a large extent, that will be to producers in the Gulf, simply because they've got large fields and a lot of it is actually onshore. So it's going to have very serious implications for the governments of these countries, particularly the newer producers, where expectations amongst the population are very optimistic about how they're going to go when they sell all this oil and gas, I suspect a lot of them will be in for a rather rude shock because the markets are not going to be there. The question is, how long will this interim period, when people are scrambling for fossil fuels and the prices have gone up, how long is that actually going to last? What is the supply response likely to be? And I think this is going to be a key question as we go forward. Oil demand is not going to disappear overnight, and it's not going to go down to zero overnight, but it will start to decline. And as it declines, as the market declines, competition will become extremely strong, which means that lower prices, lower revenue. I'll stop at that point and hand back to you, Anna Carolina.
Thank you, Paul. And this is a very worrying trend and a very confusing one, right? And on the one hand, you have the perception that this is going to push for a faster energy transition and more renewable energies. And at the same time, this interim period that you are highlighting send another signal, right, to producing countries that you can actually increase your production, that you could take advantage of these new possibilities of markets for your oil and gas. So, Linda, how these trends are being read in Ghana? How do you see policies changing in relation to these trends, and how is the debate and the discourse change based on what Paul mentioned, or the geopolitical games that these industrialized economies are now conducting with new countries around the world?
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, I think the impact of the crisis on the economy may mean that the discourse and planning for energy transition may not necessarily be priority. There may be less investments in renewables from foreign and domestic sources. Let's not forget that African countries have always highlighted on numerous occasions the fact that investment pledges have not been forthcoming. The African Development Bank stated, and I quote, that the continent will need some $3 trillion in mitigation and adaptation by 2030 to enable us implement our nationally determined contributions. The obvious question arises as to how do we in Africa finance these commitments, especially as our socio-economic development continues, unfortunately, to be low. And that's a quote from the African Development Bank. My own president reiterated during the COP26 in November 2021 that failure of the wealthy nations to honor their commitments of making available $100 billion annually to the poorer countries to assist in the fight against climate change, and by the unavailability of the technology transfer that will help us find sustainable ways of charting a path out of this existential crisis. So those are the statements that are being made. Regardless, the government of Ghana set up a committee in 2021, at the end of 2021, to consult stakeholders and draw up a plan for Ghana's energy transition. Consultations have concluded, and the first round of consultations have concluded, and the draft report and further consultations are planned this year. So we are in the process of drawing up our plan. Having said that, there are so many other plans. There are other plans that have been drawn up, and I think the key thing will be how they all come together. We've had gas master plan, we have the renewable energy plan, so many other plans. The question is, how will they all come together so that we will see a way forward, a holistic way forward, so that the synergies will be felt. the discourse generally among all stakeholders, which includes governments, CSOs, private companies, it has been leaning towards the fact that there's the need to utilize our natural resources to develop the, for our own economic growth. And I guess from what Paul has said, this position will not change as we all scramble for survival of the fittest. There's also the recognition that African countries need to be positioning to benefit from the gap in the market that Russia supply to Europe will leave. And I'll come back to that. But before then, I just want to mention the role of critical minerals, critical or green minerals, as some call it, has also come to the fore. So the question is, as with all mining, at least in Ghana and most African countries, are we in a strong position to ensure that the discovery of new critical minerals are being mined more effectively, and then the countries stand to gain more from these resources, rather than just the royalty payments and not having any stakes in this, or even developing the value chain. So rather than just being a primary resource which is exported and not develop value chains for further economic benefits. That is the challenge and the conversation that should be had with in fact, it should be the conversation had globally for all who are going to benefit from the from these critical minerals to take to be mindful of, so that again African countries are not taken advantage of. In Ghana, we have the Minerals Income Investment Fund, called MIF, has been set up to acquire participating interest in some of these new ventures. And their strategy is to enhance the collection of royalties, expand the royalty nets, and streamline communication on royalty payments from non-gold mining activities, such as manganese, salt, limestone, and quarrying. And they will be taking positions in lithium discoveries and manganese discoveries as well. So that's critical minerals, which it's an opportunity for African countries and for Ghana for that matter to use to enhance their economic development. I think African countries and Ghana for that matter can leapfrog the development of domestic energy projects. Like Paul said, renewables are really more regional, and so even at the country level, it can come further down to community. So it's not everything that should be as centralized as the provision of electricity as is currently in Ghana, for example. Everything comes from the capital. So in my view, I think renewables can be renewable projects, or developing renewable projects in communities can leapfrog energy transition projects, irrespective of what is going on. So for example, setting up a renewable project or a solar project in a village, for instance, in the first place will address the issue of energy poverty, will address the issue of energy security in some of these places. But most importantly, it will actually aid industrialization. So everyone is obviously tied to the grid. There's the high cost of utilities, which is affecting manufacturing. And so if you're able to give incentives for manufacturers to set up in communities whereby they will take advantage of renewable energy sources and at lower tariffs, we could actually start industrialization, accelerating industrialization in some of these communities. So it doesn't all have to be one big plan that everybody has to feed into, but we can start from communities low-hanging fruits to actually start somewhere. So I see that some of these communities, or rather energy transition, can be leapfrogged into the system gradually with communities that are not currently tied to the grid and are not as progressive, you know. So that's what I think. Sorry.
No, that was great, Linda, and very interesting. I think that what you mentioned about the capacity of the people in Ghana to have a broader discussion at the same time of how to take advantage of the gaps in the market to for Ghana production, and at the same time not leave aside the need for this national dialogue around the energy transition is very important. Of course, the challenges of having a holistic approach where these two elements are together and define clear paths for development for the country are important. But I also think what you mentioned in terms of inserting developing countries like Ghana in the global debates about critical minerals and the role of developing countries in critical mineral supply chain markets, and in climate finance, and how climate finance should respond to the needs of these countries and to the needs of the transition, is also a very important element. And so maybe shifting to Mexico, Anna, how it is materializing? Do you see the same trends like in Ghana? Like on the one hand, this discourse about how to take advantage of new gaps for oil and gas in the country as an exporting country, but also a push for renewable energies and a discussion about the energy transition. You mentioned actually the opposite, like this debate about the energy transition going back to previous steps in Mexico. How is this changing discourses and narratives?
Thank you, Ana Carolina. Actually, I think what Paul mentioned about going back, or you mentioned about going back into the 1970s, is very much what we've been describing has been happening in Mexico since the beginning of this administration. That going back to that nationalistic, like fossil fuel based strengthening of the state-owned companies, we describe as going back to, that's what I mean by going back to the 70s in Mexico. And that's a lot of what we have been witnessing. And actually, just like internationally and locally, we've been getting a lot of mixed messages that you were very well pointing that out from what Paul said. Like on the one hand, we get a lot of push for climate change mitigation and adaptation and increasing our NDC's ambition. And we are doing a lot of that, and as a civil society are very much pushing for that. But on the other hand, there's also these messages in the context of the Russian invasion to Ukraine and just the energy markets that are demanding more fossil fuels, and governments turning more into themselves and placing gas as a clean energy source, things like that. So I believe in Mexico and in the world, we're getting a lot of those mixed messages, and it's complicated because how can we further advocate for a just energy transition when you have the governments that are sort of helping finance that transition now doing the opposite in many ways? So that's sort of like a confusing messages that we've been getting. And in the context of nationalism, is even more complex, because how can we have an energy, like a just energy transition in the context of a nationalist government? And how can we have energy transition when the credit scores of the state-owned companies are so low? There's no resources to invest, and now the demand is for fossil fuels. So how, like, where are we getting the resources to invest in more renewable energies in developing countries? We might have, and we is a big broad generalization, but countries in Latin America might have resources to support that energy transition in terms of minerals, no? Like the soil might have the resources, but are the countries ready to provide and exploit and take advantage of those resources in a just manner? I think a lot of developing countries with like energy, like resource-rich countries, we are having to think about right now, like how do we want to govern those resources and how do we do that justly? Because a just energy transition takes a lot of time and a lot of money. And now going back to gas and going back to coal, or not going back, but like stopping the sort of like the push that we had of phasing out these resources is sort of like putting a pause on the push that we had been having for transition. And but we still have to figure out as countries, how do we want to govern those resources so that we don't repeat, I'm closing with the going back to the 70s, so that we don't repeat a lot of dynamics that are more similar to a colonialist structure. How do we want to do that? And I think we have to have those conversations internally as countries and as regions, so that we better take advantage of the resources that our countries have, but that we do that in a way that is just it's fair for the local communities, and that also enables our countries to be part of that energy transition and not just provide the inputs that other countries need. And though that might be coal one year, but the next year is going to be lithium. So we have to decide how we want to manage those. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Anna. And indeed, a lot of challenges linked to this mixed message internationally. So maybe let's move to our last round of question, which is a shorter round, maybe more based on what are your thoughts about next steps or the role of different actors in this conversation going forward. And let's start with Paul. You have been, as we presented in the introduction, a very recognized academic, helping us understanding what is happening out there. What do you think is the role of academia in these challenging times?
I think the main role of academia is to show the lessons of history. Otto von Bismarck once said, "Only a fool learns from his mistakes. I learn from other people's mistakes." And I think it's the function of academia to point out those other mistakes so that they might actually be avoided. Let me give you one example, which is very close to my heart. Oil revenue is not income. Oil revenue is not income. It is simply reshuffling the national portfolio. So you're swapping oil below ground for normally green dollars above ground. And the significance of this is because oil is depletable, and of course, as the energy transition accelerates, it becomes in a way not depletable, but less value. Then if you sell one barrel, you've got to use that revenue to invest in another income earning asset if the economy is to be stable or indeed growing. And so simply just producing the stuff does not make any sense. You have to think in terms of starting a program of diversification when the first barrel of oil is being produced. And if you don't do that, you get into the trap, which is part of the whole resource curse debate, and that is that the government gets the revenue and then uses it for whatever it thinks right, with the result that if you don't replace that asset, then it becomes unsustainable. I think that is probably the most important lesson to be learned. But academia is in a position to explain a lot of this. After all, there's nothing new about energy transitions. We've been having energy transitions for centuries. There's a lot of experience out there. Equally, energy transitions. There's a huge amount of history and experience with energy transitions. And I think it's up to the academics to try and sort of put this across, at least to start a debate, if nothing else. I'll stop at that point.
Absolutely, Paul. And if you allow me, I would add diversification now in these days in an inclusive and sustainable way. So maybe we can learn also a little bit of that. But the role of academia in explaining and pointing out what has been learned is definitely a major contribution. Let's move now to Linda. And because of your experience with GNPC, what would you think in general this means for national oil companies? What is the role of national oil companies in this moment of history when they need to take advantage of these new or interim demands, increased demands, but at the same time adapt to further future risk?
I'd say that the role of NOCs in general, even in the energy transition, even before the crisis, there were a few options. I think I can identify 4. NOCs were either going to be buying equity stakes in clean investment projects or companies, or they're going to be passive equity partners, whereby they just invest in renewable companies and let them do the work, and so it becomes, this is a green efforts kind of role, and not actually change the way they work on a day-to-day basis. NOCs could also oversee renewable projects with other SOEs, and Saudi Aramco Power is doing that with Saudi Electricity Company. Or NOCs could transition into a fully fledged integrated energy company, as Ørsted, the Danish SOE has done. However, whatever role the NOC plays will really depend on the mandate of the NOC in each country. Most NOCs, as we know, have more of a political leaning. Well, not having a political leaning, but it's forced upon them given the developmental nature that the NOC has. So if an economy is heavily dependent on the rents coming from the NOCs and the foreign exchange, energy transition may be difficult to have that full commitment, especially now that most economies are facing a crisis, and therefore the rent from these resources will be seen to be more valuable than they have been. And also they are not even assured in the longer term. So the urgency on these rents, has even become more critical for these heavily dependent economies. So most of their NOCs, I guess, may stick to business as usual, and make the half-hearted commitment to energy transition just because there's the global effort towards energy transition. So they may invest in certain solutions, but smaller NOCs that do not have more of heavy reliance on the rent may make more progress in terms of committing their funds to more renewable projects and investing less in fossil fuels. Does the NOC have the capacity to adapt, innovate, change its course, and become a player in the renewable space? It's a key question. Should the NOC be a player in the renewable space? Is another question, because are there other more suitable organizations or institutions that should be playing fully in the renewable space, given that NOCs by their nature are not seen to be the most cost-efficient organizations when it comes to undertaking projects? So all these questions are, will determine or should determine what role the NOC plays. But the NOC can always bring the political clout in that they can determine or help shape policies in the country. And strong NOCs with political clout can help shape the discourse, so long as there's the political will for energy transition to be key. But the challenges of ending up with projects led by the NOCs that may come to naught just because they invested in the wrong projects, because they did not consult widely and engage with companies that are more suited for renewable projects, may be the downfall of some NOCs. So that's my take on what NOCs can bring to the table in terms of the energy transition. But in terms of the crisis, I mean, I've mentioned some of them, but there are opportunities, obviously, and developing new markets for their current propositions, current assets is key on the agenda of most NOCs. Energy security is something that has become more prominent in Europe, and I think sometime this week, the European Union Commissioner signed an agreement with Azerbaijan for them to scale up their supply of gas to the European Union. There's been the discussions about Africa filling the gap that Russia would leave behind, but the lady made a statement, the commissioner made a statement, which I think is quite telling, and she stated that our goal is to double the gas delivery from Azerbaijan to the EU in a few years. Azerbaijan will be a crucial partner for our security of supply and on our way to climate neutrality. So really, even though, yes, there's the gap that needs to be filled, and 2030 is that timeline on the horizon that everybody's talking about, I think we should not forget that Europe will speed up its transitioning. They will speed up the transitioning proposition, because what's the point of finding new markets and just remaining at the status quo? But it should be really finding new markets for a short term and speeding up to transitioning into renewables, so that they meet their goals. So African countries should be mindful of that. And how are we shaped to, or how are these NOCs shaped to take advantage of these gaps? Projects in Africa take a long time to come to fruition. Projects that are already in the pipeline, for instance, in Tanzania, in Angola. In fact, Angola has signed some declaration of intent to increase cooperation for gas exploration, production, and trading. Algeria is increasing its projects in the solar space. Tanzania, Senegal, they have projects in the pipeline which may or may not come to fruition before. Sorry, they may come to fruition, but with the race to 2030, how many years will be left for NOCs to actually benefit fully from this before they are left with stranded assets? So I think I'll leave it at that, but I think NOCs in Africa especially do have a lot to think about, and there's no easy way out on this. Thank you.
Definitely not, Linda. And as you say, planning in this framework requires a very smart balancing of short-term trends and short-term needs for the NOCs and for the country in general, and the long-term trends, and how do you prepare for those longer-term trends to be able to respond to those challenges. So we have been receiving already some questions on the Q&A section. Please, to all the attendees and participants, feel free to ask your question or provide your reflections in the Q&A section. But before jumping into the Q&A section, let me just ask you, Anna, about the role of civil society. The civil society has been a very strong and important actor in building the natural resource governance field and the need for governance in this sector. How do you see the role for civil society these days with these confusing messages at the same time with the climate change commitments and with these needs to push for an energy transition that is also just for communities at the local level?
Thank you, Anna. I think our responsibility as civil society is to advocate and somehow channel the voices of population that are not being directly heard or directly considered. And this is as broad and specific as it can get. What we are trying to do specifically in Mexico is remind ourselves, remind other organizations, remind governments at the national and subnational level of who is the most vulnerable population here, and what is at stake if we don't do anything or if we move a certain way. In Mexico, but as well as globally, the most vulnerable populations are the ones least responsible for the climate crisis. And these are the population groups that we have to put at the center right now and have to be part of the decisions that are being taken. What we are trying to do, and we should do even more, is try to bring everyone to the table and try to design an energy transition, a climate transition, a socioeconomic transformation, because beyond in specific energy transitions, what we are needing globally is a socioeconomic transformation towards a sustainable now and a sustainable future. But we cannot do that if we don't bring everyone into the table and if we don't actively involve those that are more vulnerable and that are going to be getting more vulnerable in very specific things. And in regards also to state-owned companies and state investments, is that we have to be very careful to sort of like watchdog what our governments are investing in. In Mexico, there's a lot of resources in a crisis, in an economic and macroeconomic crisis context. There's a lot of resources going to build an oil refinery that is actually going to flood as sea level is rising. There are there's a lot of resources being wasted on infrastructure that we already know is going to be stranded assets in just a few years, that it should not even be living its life cycle. And governments are investing in that. And this is the case in Mexico, but I know it's also real in other countries in Latin America. So pushing for that is something that we have to do as civil society. And there are like some spaces that we have found which are extremely valuable that fit into subnational governments and national government priorities and climate action, which is increasing distributed generation capacity, for example. And that's a lot of what we have been trying to do, and also be able to think outside the box and think of different property schemes and different sizes of renewable energy projects. So maybe looking at it from different perspectives. So, okay, maybe we don't like but maybe we might not want huge solar complexes, or maybe we don't want huge wind farms, but maybe we do want a lot of small ones, and maybe partly owned by local communities or fully owned by local communities. How do we do that? And we're trying to move towards that, because also from civil society, we're doing a lot of research, and we have done a lot of research that can be put in the table. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, indeed, when we discuss about natural resources for development, we mention a lot the need for natural resources to be extracted to benefit population, right? But many times we forget who these populations are, and the voices are not necessarily included in this highly technical and close space of decision making in relation to energy policy. So definitely a role for civil society to be upfront and ensure that different voices are brought to the table when these discussions are happening, to ensure that indeed new schemes, new configurations of energy benefit population as a whole. So thank you all for these insights and reflections. And we are now moving to the sections of Q&A. We have already 2 questions in the pipeline, and I think more will come soon. But the first one, I think, is a question that you all may want to respond, as it relates kind of a broader challenge for developing countries. And which I think is the question of, as you read it, is the existential challenge that many developing countries have to deal with. How does this complicate the desire to move to the just transition? And what would be a reasonable pathway? So you have mentioned pieces of it, but maybe it would be very interesting to position yourself as a producing countries. If you were a producing countries, how would you manage this mix message? How would you combine, maybe taking advantage of this interim period that Paul mentioned, of exploiting your resources to get additional royalties? How do you combine that with preparing to transition out from fossil fuels, or to transition to renewable energies? Because at the end, resources are scarce, so you don't have all the resources you need how would you prioritize? And maybe to your point, Paul, on it depends on which country we're talking about, maybe, and what type of oil production we are talking about, how costly production costs, et cetera. So what would be your advice, maybe in Mexico and Ghana, but more broadly?
The big question. I think if I was king of the world, then what I would do would be to take the oil revenue and invest it in infrastructure to help promote the private sector. Now, what that means is investing in productive activities, and the most obvious one I can think of is education. If you put a lot of resources into education, then this is a real investment for the future. The problem is, if the government is the one that are making these decisions, that can be a problem. Governments are very good at picking losers. Losers are very good at picking governments. And what you really need is an active, dynamic private sector. And this is not a sort of World Bank type of approach, but if you look at those countries that have succeeded in diversifying, they all have effective private sectors. Unfortunately, that comes down as much as anything to the sort of political culture of the country. So if you have a bunch of kleptocrats in charge, then that's actually not going to happen. So it does come down to issues to do with property rights and rule of law, which is all very vague and indeterminate, but that for me is the key. So that is what I would spend the revenue on, is to strengthen institutions so that you can develop an active, dynamic private sector.
Thank you, Paul. And I think a very timely discussion on the kleptocrats of the world, because what we are seeing as a result of the Ukrainian crisis and war is exactly the opposite, right? The kleptocrats of the world being empowered enough by these oil revenues as well to be producing these impacts that we are seeing today. Linda, Anna, do you want to comment on this? How would you balance if you were producing countries? What do you think is a good balance for a country?
I'll just say that in Ghana, we have what we call the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, which actually spells out how the revenue, the petroleum revenue should be managed. So it takes away the burden from the NOC as to what to do with the revenue, because the NOC is given an allocation, which is stated in the law. However, the distribution of the rest of the revenue is to ensure that there are investments in projects. What's the discourse has been over the years is how effective is the distribution into these projects, that there's supposed to be a project committee that will select the projects and fund these projects. There are challenges according to PIAC reports, which is the public, the name escapes me, but it's a statutory body that's supposed to report on the management of the revenues. Most of these projects are uncompleted and so forth and so on. So the question is, yes, some of the intentions are good, but how we finally execute and account for these resources that have been placed at the disposal of these committees set up to ensure that there's a lasting legacy of projects and of projects that will impact positively the economy. It's not forthcoming. So yes, Paul is right, invest in lasting legacies and all that, but it comes down to implementation.
Thank you, Linda. And yes, the implementation gap is indeed something we have discussed, a huge challenge for our countries. Anna, do you want to comment on that? I mean, on that, or maybe another thought about what would you do if you were to balance the current situation in your country?
Well, first of all, Mexico is not actually Mexico is importing 70% of its gas, for example. So the country is not necessarily that exporter of oil or gas. So I think we have to do like that mind shift within Mexico, because for so many years we've been told the story that we are such a rich oil company, and that was like something that we could take advantage of. And currently we're producing very low quality crude that is also, we have a lot of fuel oil, for example. So if I were queen of the world or my country, making reference to how Paul addressed it, I would just use the resources to start phasing it out. And in doing that, in financing the transition, figuring out what we're gonna do to all of those people now involved in that industry, how are we gonna transition into cleaner, more sustainable industries, and what is, figure out what's the minimum that we're gonna have to keep exploiting, and figure out how we wanna do that and how we're gonna do it as clean as possible. Things like that. Like that would be my approach, and would bring into the table and the discussion all the different sectors.
Thank you, Anna. So there is a second question about energy security, and many of you mentioned these in your reflections about how energy security has come back as the main concern of countries. And how do you think we can ponder, because energy security is an issue. I mean, we cannot deny that there is an issue about energy security for many countries, but how we can counteract this trend or ensure that it doesn't water down the need for energy transition.
Can I start on this one?
Sure, Paul, go ahead.
Energy security of supply as a policy objective most definitely supports a rapid energy transition, simply because if you're going to get more renewables, renewables have the virtue that they are domestically produced. And if they're domestically produced, at least once you've got the infrastructure in place, then this means that you have security of energy supply. The other big advantage of renewables, and I think this is worth emphasizing, is that it's small scale, or can be small scale, and decentralized. In other words, you don't need networks. Now, I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but it used to be about 1/3 of the world's population does not have access to commercial energy. In other words, energy poverty is a big deal. Now, one of the solutions to this is small scale decentralized. For those of you with long memories, if you go back 25 years, there was a debate then about telephones in Africa. And people said, oh, you'll never get a good telephone network in Africa because it's too big, too many wires all over the place. Well, now, of course, you've got a perfectly good telephone network in Africa because of the change in technology. Equally, if you have more renewables, this is a very positive way of trying to alleviate fuel poverty. So the two objectives, far from sort of contradicting each other, are actually complementary.
Thank you, Paul. That's very straightforward. What do you think, Linda or Anna, or do you want to comment on that and on the discussion about energy security? It seems like very clear, but it doesn't seem very clear for many leaders in our countries, right? Any?
I agree. I completely agree with Paul. And again, just to point out the thing that's happening here is that we have a narrative for energy security that it's now being said, like, see, now Europe is doing what I have been saying we should be doing. Like, that's what the narrative is sort of going on in Mexico. Yet we are dependent on gas imports. So I think it doesn't make sense. So I completely agree with Paul that if we want to move towards less dependency, we have to move towards more renewables. And we have to make a better case of that out there.
Linda?
Yeah, I think I did mention about leapfrogging communities that are currently not without access to the energy, or rather power, to develop those communities with renewable projects that will also accelerate industrialization. So I think I touched on that because really I think that's the only way, and Paul has reiterated that about domestic production and small communities. Yeah.
Sorry, Ana Carolina, something I think we haven't mentioned, and we should have it somewhere in our minds in a conversation around this, is that we also have to be thinking and addressing not only the production side and the government side, but also the consumption. And we need to also be thinking of like changing consumption patterns, and the degrowth discourse has now is becoming more and more popular as we start seeing more challenging future scenarios for decarbonization. So I think that's something we all have to have in mind, even if we are just starting to understand how that can look like. We also have to consider the consumption side of the energy and how to decrease that.
Thank you all. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and I have a question of my own, if I may add as well. And so let me just share the question and just open the floor for whoever wants to respond. First question is about, let me check here. This is not, yeah. So the first question is about something that some of you mentioned, about earmarking additional portions of the oil, gas, and mining revenues during the expected upcoming boom linked to these high prices, to the development of renewable energies. So with a view of promoting energy transition, right? Like how to use these oil revenues or oil, gas, and mining revenues to promote the energy transition. Do you think that's realistic? there is a possibility to do that in your countries. Anna or Linda, this is a question that is specifically targeted to Linda and Anna. And maybe let me just add another question of my own, and maybe to Paul, but also to Linda and Anna, if you want to comment, which is about this mixed message. So we have seen the European Union signing memorandums of understanding in the last months with different countries here and there, with Senegal, now with Egypt and Israel, to ensure that the provision of gas is assured for the European Union. One could not tell if this is actually going to happen, like if these memorandums of understanding are going to materialize in a real gas coming from these countries to Europe, or if this is just kind of a plan B or something to have in case of need, given the fact that at the same time the European Union is moving towards pushing for more renewables. So how do you see these geopolitics playing out in these discussions? Because what we are observing is, yes, a commitment from Europe to continue and push for renewable energies and for the energy transition, but at the same time, signing these memorandums of agreement with gas producing countries is sending different messages, right? Or how these memorandums of understanding and how these agreements should include some type of commitments from European countries to help promote the energy transition in those countries as well. So to ensure that they are not kind of pushing even further or kind of engaging in dynamics of carbon locking with this agreement in these countries. So two questions for whoever wants to start responding.
Well, I'll give it a go.
Okay.
On the first question, in Mexico, we have had different attempts of putting into law sort of like a percentage of the revenue being somehow distributed. And to be honest, and not get into the details, I don't think it has worked. We still see local communities be extremely affected and not really benefited by the extraction of whichever resource. So I think it is and should be possible, and we have to learn from what we already have that is not working. So we would have to do it differently than what we have right now. There are some organizations pushing towards changing, for example, our mining law in this sense, so that we don't repeat those mistakes with lithium. But yeah, just to answer that very specifically. And towards your question, Ana Carolina, I think it's right. That would make sense to somehow put like a final date on, yes, I'm gonna buy more coal, but not more than this quantity, and maybe I'm gonna support you in this way. But it's also a little bit, it's a little bit again like colonialist, and I don't want to get too much delved into the term or the complications, but let me use your resources while I need them, but then I will later push you so that you stopped using them yourself. And I might give you like 2 pennies to stop it because you really need like hundreds of thousands of billions of dollars, but I'm going to give you just a little bit so that I later don't feel bad that I contributed to the exploitation. So I kind of have also mixed feelings about that, although in practice it makes sense. But I think we have to think of other approaches so that we don't incentivize an industry that we really want to get rid of.
Can I address your question in terms of the percentage, putting a percentage of revenue into a fund to do something with? I mean, this is the Norwegian model, and the Norwegian model is brilliant. The only difficulty is the only way you can replicate the Norwegian model is to start with 4.5 million Norwegians. In many other countries, all you're doing is just creating a pot to be raided by those that do the raiding. It's far better in a way if you create an institutional legal framework to allow the renewables to be done and encouraged by the private sector. If the government really wants to encourage renewables, then an obvious way of doing it is to have a carbon price. The problem with that is it's going to have to be an international carbon price, and that raises all sorts of complex issues.
Linda, do you want to comment on the earmarking revenues for from oil revenues for renewables?
Yes, so I did mention about the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, which sets out revenue allocation. So should there be an allocation from that towards renewables? I think, given the way the structure is at the moment, I think that would be the smartest thing, that there's an allocation from that to support renewables. I don't know if the the plan that the committee will bring up will actually look at how funding will be or should be, you know, how projects should be funded, but it will make a lot more sense for renewables to start gaining prominence within these projects mix, which cover a wide range of sectors that have also been set up in the law. So I think that may be the smartest thing we do, but it still does not change the fact that if we don't get better at implementing projects and you know, better project management, we may still end up with half-baked projects at very high cost and depleting the funds that we have. So yeah, we do have the framework in place which could actually make that happen and happen quickly. But it's just a matter of, is there the willingness and also how we execute. Yeah.
Can I pick up on your question about the Memorandum of Understanding and the extent to which they're going to lead to sort of new supplies of gas coming into Europe? The problem with a lot of these is that they ignore there is a fundamental problem with transit pipelines. And if I've done a lot of work looking at the history of transit pipelines, and generally speaking, they face all sorts of problems. Often it's assumed that the problems are to do with political divisions. But when you look at a lot of the disputes, it actually comes down to something much more venal and much simpler, and that is disputes over transit fees. Now, if you look at the geography to see where these pipelines are going to, for gas I'm talking about now, because oil doesn't matter so much, you just put it in a tanker and off it goes. But for gas, you need pipelines, or possibly LNG, although those are extremely expensive projects. And if you look at a history of transit pipelines, you wouldn't go near a lot of these projects, simply because you'd be so vulnerable. Once the pipeline is built, you effectively become a hostage to fortune. So I don't see it's likely you're going to see a lot of pipeline deals. LNG, yes, because again, you're not limited to the particular pipeline.
Thank you, Paul. And so with that, we are coming close to the end of this event, but I would like to provide you as panelists, maybe with a couple of minutes more, if there is some reflection you would like to share, something we haven't discussed, definitely Linda, for another panel to discuss about the management of revenues. This is indeed a huge challenge for what is coming. But if you want to share any other reflections on the global crisis, or how it's been managed at the local level, or how do we push for an energy transition that is inclusive and sustainable. To your point as well, Anna, on consumption. And the need to rethink the consumption side of things. So what would be your general reflections about these issues, if you want to add something?
Can I just, I've not said anything about this. This is about a just transition. Let me put my academic hat on and let's look at the history of just transitions. It doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. The best example I can give you is the United Kingdom. When we closed down our coal mines, all sorts of promises were made that the mining communities would be protected, it would be a just transition. In reality, they were just dumped. So if you're hoping for a just transition, don't hold your breath, sadly.
Wow, we need a more optimistic message after that.
No, I'm too old and cynical for that.
Anna, do you want to say something?
I'm very sad now. No, thank you for your honesty, Paul. To be honest, all of your interventions have been very interesting and mind-opening. And all that I can say is that we have to try. What I believe is that we cannot fight the climate crisis, and we cannot fight climate change with the same logic that in which we created it. So whatever transition we do, be it energetic, be it just like a transition, climate transitions in general, we have to think of addressing it differently than the way we have been addressing it as of now, because we have just been sort of revolving in a spiral that has been taking us further into the issue and into the challenge, where the most vulnerable are the most affected, and the solutions are oftentimes not including those affected. So we have to do it differently, and we have to be innovative in terms of how we do it. And we might not have all the answers right now, but we have to continue to try and continue to think. And the idea of decentralized distributed generation is not something that can be put into the table. Will that be enough? Probably not. So we have to be thinking of other things. And again, going back to that, the transform, like this, a socioeconomic transformation more than a specific transition. It might go through there. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. And I think both the audience and ourselves have a lot of more thinking to do, of course, with the support and learning the experiences of from the past that academia can bring, because sometimes we're so delved in our own immediate project implementation that we forget to think of the big picture. So thank you for that. You're muted, Ana Karen.
Sorry, any final words, Linda?
Yes, I'd just like to say that African countries should look at developing value chains for their newly discovered critical minerals, and not just be a raw material exporter as we have with previous, with other, minerals, especially gold. I mean, there should be the global conversation about equitable, equitable or fairer, what should I say? Terms so that even if these MOUs come to something, it is hoped that fairer terms have been negotiated with these countries, that technology transfer really will be a part of the package, and the production of gas or whatever these utilities are, or these resources are going to be done greener than they are currently done, because even if we are still producing oil, can we do it better than we are currently doing? Can we produce gas fairer, greener, more sustainably than is currently being done. And I think that's what the conversation should be with those signing the various MOUs, and there should be help from all angles to ensure that level of fairness. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Linda. And with that, we have come to the end of this great panel. Thank you to the three of you for all your reflections and ideas, and for this very interesting conversation. And thank you to my colleagues in ETH Zurich for their support, and to all the team that allowed this event to happen, to Felicitas, to Mateo, to Leonor, and to Fritz. Thanks a lot. And thank you all for participating and continue to be connected in this discussion. And to the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.